This next one though was the most difficult one for me.
And it was even more difficult than rookie of the year. I don't think I feel as passionately about this one because there isn't that same, like, all three of these guys are going to have just ridiculous jaw-dropping careers, and so it feels like unnecessary disrespect to have Cade Cunningham at number 3 in rookie of the year, even if it's justified. um but yeah, I mean, this one it was so difficult because of the injuries, because there isn't a clear front runner or even set of front runners this year. So, like, you can easily consider Giannis Antetokounmpo for the free safety role that he fills for the Milwaukee Bucks, Jaren Jackson Jr. for his status as a defensive centerpiece for the Memphis Grizzlies. I had Robert Williams III in my number 1 spot, and I think that case gets a little bit harder to make now that he's out for 4 to 6 weeks. But on the flip side, the Celtics have lost 2 straight games since that happened. They're 7-9 sit without him in the lineup this season, and just clearly aren't the same defensive powerhouse without him on the floor. And I want to look past the numbers here, which are overwhelmingly positive for him. Partially because defense is so hard to quantify, but also because I think we often see players who become schemes unto themselves. Rudy Gobert is probably the most prominent example in the last few years within the NBA. But Williams had such a ridiculously good skill set as both a primary rim protector and a smothering help defender who can just kind of warp into whatever position he needs to be, that Ime Udoka built a unique scheme to maximize his abilities. And this kind of ties in with my desire to have him in the Coach of the Year race, because by having the Celtics employ these unorthodox switching schemes, he was showing just how important Robert Williams is to this defense. There are so many other good pieces. I actually have Marcus Smart 3rd on my ballot, as weird as it is to have 2 players from the same team on the same ballot, because Smart keys everything that they do on the perimeter with that switching, because he's impervious to matchup difficulty. But it was designed in a way that you can make the most of Williams's otherworldly help defense skills. And it has resulted in a defense that was so far and away the best unit in basketball, I would say, on either end of the floor for half of the season, the most important half at the second after the break and all of that, until he did go down. I have Bam Adebayo sandwiched between the 2 Celtics. Again, another guy who spent a lot of time injured, but is just so impactful because of the versatility and his ability to bring everything together on the defensive end for Spoelstra. But I just can't stop myself from wanting to give so much credit to this pair of Celtics defenders that I legitimately considered having Williams first and Smart second.
So your ballot is Williams, Adebayo,
and then Smart.
Okay, we had drastically different ballots here. I did not have either of the Celtics on my ballot, and I know Boston now is the best defense in the NBA. That very much seems like a success by committee example, and I'm not trying to detract from what either of them have done. I don't think what Robert Williams is allowed to do on defense works as well without having a blanket in Marcus Smart who can defend 1 through 4. I don't think it works as well without having 2 really good away from the ball defenders in Tatum and Brown. I don't think it works as well if you don't have Al Horford as a luxury in certain lineups as well. And when so much of what he does is predicated on being sort of a read and react, help rim protector, the case is diluted a little bit for me. I think more so.
See, I would argue the opposite, though, because much like with most improved player, where it's difficult to go from good to great, but it's even harder to go from great to otherworldly, it was an approach by committee, and Smart isn't as successful without Williams behind him and vice versa. But to go from otherworldly to whatever this Celtics defense had been when operating at peak powers, I think that speaks to just how unique and impactful those skill sets were, even if they had to operate in conjunction with each other. But I totally get your argument too. And I think that you can make a solid case for like 7 people in this award.
Right. And look, you look at the individual defensive numbers, and like when Williams plays without Marcus Smart, like the Celtics defense is still verging on elite. And so I do think he's a really good defender. How do you also reconcile the fact that now he's going to miss time, and he's not even, as of right now, he's not the most played big on the roster. Like that belongs to Al Horford. And so I don't want to say everything around him is a safety net. I would argue that Boston's defense is I think Marcus Smart's a more important defender to Boston than Robert Williams. That's just hands down for me. And that's really just, you watch them and that's how you feel. And I know Robert Williams has been a monster. And I think because you have so many talented defenders, for me, it diluted their case. And so I'm going to go in reverse order here. I didn't have Bam Adebayo on here either. Maybe I'm waiting playing time a little bit too much there. I know he's picked up since he's returned from his own injury. The stuff he can do on defense is incredible. I don't know if I'm dinging him because I feel like he doesn't do some of the traditional big man stuff as well enough to qualify, but like he's even someone that you trust. If you need him to do what Robert Williams III does, Bam Adebayo is going to do it better than Robert Williams III is sort of how I look at it. And maybe not so much with the help rim protection, but you're talking about having to defend away from the basket. You don't have a case for Robert Williams there. You're shaking your head, but there's no case.
No, there's not. But Boston has also developed a scheme that it doesn't need to happen.
And so why are you giving Robert Williams III Defensive Player of the Year? So you're saying it's more scheme-based is my point.
Boston is a tricky one because everything has worked together to create this. I don't think that if you have a more traditional defensive scheme that Williams suddenly becomes a non-DPOY candidate. He's probably not the leading one because he isn't so fully maximized, but his ability to do what no one else can really do allowed them to put this scheme into place. It's the chicken and the egg argument.
Yeah, I guess that's just interesting to say that you think that Robert Williams III is already better defensively than Bam Adebayo. I
didn't say that.
You're shaking your head when I'm talking about Bam Adebayo versus Robert Williams III. So what are you saying then?
I'm shaking your head when you say Bam Adebayo can do everything Robert Williams does better.
I said most things. Like I said, I probably trust Robert Williams.
I think you said everything.
Then most things, whatever.
We'll have to go to the tape.
Then, so I have, now I'm all thrown after that. I do not have either of those guys in ballots. My ballot is actually, I have Giannis third. I know he has a safety net in Drew Holiday that allows him to do certain things that he wouldn't otherwise. The Bucks defense has actually been better when Giannis plays without Drew Holiday. His positional malleability, even when the matchup data is not going to support versatility, this is someone who has had to play the five for long stretches, and Milwaukee's defense is held up. He can still party crash literally everything away from the ball. Still sort of the basis for what everything Milwaukee's able to do. Their defense has not been great, but it's been great when he's on the floor and including during certain of his solo minutes there. So he came in at number 3 for me. Rudy Gobert was number 2. He is still just the foundation of everything Utah is doing. They are very clearly an elite defensive team when he's on the court. I do wonder if he should be penalized because he's not able to uplift their transition defense. Then again, that's not really his responsibility to do that. And they seem like, how much do you discredit some of the moments that he's on the court when it's really just dribble penetration gets through Utah's point of attack or their perimeter in general, because there's just no one who can contain it. There's Royce O'Neal, and that's it, at least on a semi-consistent basis. So that was tough. But when you look at, and because both Utah and Milwaukee are not great defensive teams overall this season, and I think the award normally does go to great defensive teams, I think it makes their actual cases a little bit more flimsier. But when I look at what they're doing on the floor and the type of impact they have, and Rudy Gobert specifically, that is someone who is manipulating almost every single aspect of the opposing offense while doing it more alone than I think anyone on this list that we've discussed to this point. My actual pick, and I thought a lot about this, is Mikael Bridges.
I had a feeling that's where you're going.
Phoenix is second in points allowed per possession overall. And where a lot of people are going to go off is that the Suns are actually better defensively when Mikael Bridges is off the court. The assignments that he is tackling, no one we have discussed guards number one options more often. He grades out as having per B-ball index the highest matchup difficulty of anyone on this list. He's actually in the top 10 of both matchup difficulty and the time spent guarding the number one option among everyone who's played at least 1,500 minutes this season. He's just in the top 10 of those categories altogether. I think you also look at someone who blends the off ball and the on ball. Like, you're going to put him on basically every single opponent's best player unless that best player is a big. Isn't going to defend power forward as much as Marcus Smart, but he's equally capable of going after 1s and 2s and 3s. He is, to me, one of the most, let's say, throw a number on it, 5 or 7 most impactful transition defenders in the NBA. The way that he can change plays when he's forced to guard the ball handler after screens, or if you look, when we talk about perimeter players being able to defend both sides of the pick and roll, whenever we talk about that, I feel like we're focusing on bigs. Who doesn't get burned in those situations? I think one of the most recent examples, like Mikael Bridges is guarding Joel Embiid in pick and rolls against Philly at certain points, and he's still able to play both sides of that pick and roll on the same possession, maneuvering back and forth. It is so hard to make entry passes, pick and roll passes with him just being there. I already mentioned the transition stuff, and you just sort of combine that with the night-to-night workload that he has. He's played in every single game since he's entered the NBA. This is someone who's literally doing it every single night. So I understand there's more nuance and haziness to this award, and there are people who are more qualified to talk about it than I am. I don't think you're wrong for putting the Celtics on this. Marcus Smart, I have him at number 4 right now. Draymond would have been my clear number 1 if he's only played he's not even playing 50 games this year. I also think Bam Adebayo deserves honorable mention. Also, shout out Dorian Finney-Smith, who's going to deserve at least like tangential mentions here as well. I would not have picked Robert Williams III. Maybe I'm too low on him. I think he's an egregious winner, if I'm being honest, but I don't like everything you said. Like, I totally get it. This was hard. And I know that we only have 2 non-bigs in the last 25 years that have won this award. And I know that the numbers do matter. And like, when you look at the advanced metrics, you're going to come back with Gobert, Giannis, or Draymond. You're going to come back with those 3, plus Robert Williams III is sprinkled in. Some of the advanced numbers really love him, even Embiid. And then even Smart sometimes before Mikael Bridges. But when you look at what he does and how good Phoenix is defensively, and yes, he has Chris Paul by him, he has DeAndre Ayton by him, but he ties so much of these different things together. And he's a huge reason why you're also able to navigate certain stretches without key players. So it's Mikael Bridges for me. I guess I could change that by the end of the year. That was the single toughest choice, though. And single toughest.
This is the toughest one.
If I'm being honest.
Yeah, I think so too. Without Draymond Green included, just because he hasn't played enough, I think that there are really like 7 reasonable choices. The 3 I mentioned, the 3 you mentioned, and then Jaren Jackson Jr. And I don't care that much what order you put them in, because ultimately, like, I know it seems like it's disrespect to leave someone off your ballot entirely. To me, the gap between 1 and 7 here is pretty small, like smaller than we typically see from 2 to 3 in most years.
I think in Defensive Player of the Year, you almost rely on there being a consensus for most people.
Yeah, like, just because so much of defense is narrative based too, because we don't know all the schemes, and we don't know. If we're watching a game, it's pretty easy to tell when someone messes up on offense. If there's a breakdown on defense, like, you and I are not the X's and O's experts who are going to be able to tell you like, yep, that's on that guy. In some cases, sure, but not every time.
Right. And that's what it makes it tough for me. But I think it's tough in general, even if you are that person, because even with offense, there's numbers and really granular data that can back up what you're seeing or inform how you're watching something. It just doesn't, the numbers aren't going to do that on defense. And it's why I do feel a little uncomfortable picking Mikael Bridges when you're looking at the on and off stuff. But this is probably the situation where you need to rise above it. And so I'm totally with you. This was the toughest
and
one.
That's why I'm okay with you saying that you feel Williams is an egregious winner choice. And I'm good with that. That's not going to change my mind here, just because I have not watched a team this season and felt like one player was more integral to a scheme than he was. And that scheme happens to be the most suffocating. Except what?
Except Draymond, I'm assuming.
Yeah. I mean, over a large enough sample. But that scheme happens to be the most stifling one in the NBA this season. So those two aligned for me. And my perception of defense is going to be different than your perception. We can't lean on the numbers as much. So if you had said that my MVP choice, my Rookie of the Year choice, my Sixth Man of the Year choice is an egregious winner, that's going to bother me a little bit, because I value your opinion. I still value your opinion here, but it's not going to bother me as much. And in a lot of ways, I'm glad that we deviated from each other on this one, because we did not share these ballots except for Executive of the Year before we started recording, and we've been in lockstep through and through.
It's interesting that you say that about Rob Williams III, though, because like I would get that feeling from Gobert way before Rob Williams III. I even get
maybe I'm just so used to that with Gobert.
And the other thing is, like, I do think Gobert is probably more irreplaceable to what the Jazz are doing because there's no one else. But like Mikael Bridges has a trickle down effect that makes everyone better, which is, if you're going to have Gobert or Ayton calling out your coverages, the article from, I think it was Tim Bontemps, where you had Gobert and Embiid talking about big men directing coverages. We probably don't consider that enough. No. And I know Mikael Bridges isn't necessarily doing that, but the stuff he's able to do on defense, it changes the way that Chris Paul can operate and even Ayton can operate. Whereas with Ayton and Gobert, I don't know if it's having that same level of trickle down to the perimeter players. Where in Utah, it's very specifically like, we need to funnel guys towards Gobert because there's just no other option. And that's not Gobert's fault. There's only so much he can do from there. And I think people will generally argue that big men are covering more positions and responsible for more things than perimeter guys. I don't disagree. Mikael Bridges just feels like one of the exceptions this year because I just don't feel like he receives enough credit for being an all-around guy. Where I feel like the narrative or the spin was he's so good away from the ball. I've always thought he's been a lot better off the ball than advertised. The stuff he does off the ball is incredible, but the ability to toggle between both on the same possessions and then he can disrupt transition opportunities, prevent them altogether. Teams, when Mikael Bridges are on the floor, get out in transition so much less against Phoenix. And he's a big reason why. Whether it's because he's ending possessions or sort of erasing them before they start. And I don't know if when people listen, if they're just going to strongly disagree. This was just so tough this year, which I think is going to make for just interesting year-end summaries.